Hello everyone, my name is Ryan and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about psychological warfare tactics used by the Americans as well as the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was already one of questionable moral ethics, using chemical agents like Agent Orange, a chemical herbicide originally intended to strip away vegetation in the Vietnamese jungle and expose hideouts and soldiers, but instead ended up giving millions of Vietnamese and Americans cancer, birth defects, and severe neurological issues. On the other side of the war, the Vietnamese used an elaborate variety of traps intended to severely harm American soldiers, such as punji traps, which were shallow pits lined with sharp spikes and often covered in feces, urine, or poisons to guarantee severe infections. While most people know about the chemical agents and guerrilla warfare used during the Vietnam War, few people realize how significant psychological warfare became. Both the Americans and the North Vietnamese attempted to create fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, and a reduced willingness to fight. The Vietnam War was a particularly brutal environment for this kind of warfare because both sides were already struggling in all of these aspects. The American troops were used to overwhelming military superiority, yet in Vietnam they faced constant ambushes, confusing and claustrophobic jungle terrain, and an enemy that used every aspect of its land and people to fight back. Morale was also damaged by logistical and equipment issues. Early in the war, many American troops were issued wooden stock M14 rifles, and Vietnam's extreme heat and humidity caused swelling, warping, and reliability problems in the weapons. On the other hand, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters faced constant bombarding campaigns, artillery strikes, chemical attacks, food shortages, disease, and the ever-present threat of American air superiority. Many of their fighters spent years living in tunnels, jungles, and isolated camps under extremely harsh conditions. With all of these constant issues threatening their lives, both sides were already at the point of physical and psychological exhaustion. The Vietnam War progressed through a wide variety of psychological operations from both sides throughout the conflict. Early efforts often focused on propaganda pamphlets, surrender appeals, and promises of food, money, safety, or relocation for soldiers willing to defect. And as the war intensified, these operations became more personal and psychologically aggressive. One of the most famous examples emerged in 1965 with the broadcast of Hanoi Hannah, a North Vietnamese radio personality whose voice became recognizable to many American troops stationed in Vietnam. Rather than relying on loud intimidation tactics, Hanoi Hannah's broadcasts were calm, direct, and personal. She spoke directly to American GIs, discussed anti-war protests happening back in the United States, read casualty information, and attempted to convince soldiers that the war was hopeless and the American public no longer supported them. For many troops, the most disturbing part of the broadcast was how informed they sometimes appeared to be, occasionally referencing real military units, recent casualties, or political events happening back home. Now, whether these were accurate or exaggerated, the broadcasts were designed to create uncertainty, homesickness, frustration, and an emotional exhaustion among American forces. Her broadcasts sounded something like this.
GI, your government has abandoned you. They have ordered you to die, GI. Do not trust them. Defect, GI. It is a very good idea to leave a sinking ship. They lie to you, GI. You know you cannot win this war. Your rich leaders grow richer while you die in the swamp, GI. They will give you a medal, GI, but only after you are dead. Your government lies to you every day, poor soldier. You have lost this war, GI. Your army will leave you behind. Imperialists make you fight this war, GI. They do not care about you. GI, your government has betrayed you. You will not return for you. GI, your airplanes bomb your own men. You are not safe here. The skies are dangerous, GI. They will napalm you tonight. Your pilots do not care that you are down here, GI. You cannot dig foxhole to hide in, GI Joe. Your bombers will find you. GI, your helicopters fall from the sky like broken birds. They cannot see from your airplanes, GI. They come to bomb you.
Imagine being an American soldier hearing that in the middle of the jungle, or even worse, one of the cities you've been told you saved from the Viet Cong. Hanoi Hannah wasn't causing mass desertion or striking fear into the hearts of Americans, but it gave a certain unease. It made them question themselves, and even something like that can alter the direction of a war over time. Hanoi Hannah's broadcasts continued for years and became a memorable propaganda tool in the Vietnam War. This went on for years before the Americans officially made their own form of psychological warfare to this level. Around 1968, the Americans created an operation with similar goals but took a drastically different way of achieving them. Operation Wandering Soul was an interesting Psy-Op experiment that attempted to tie into Vietnam's cultural and spiritual beliefs. Unlike Hanoi Hannah's broadcasts, which focused more on morale, hopelessness, and anti-war sentiment, Operation Wandering Soul essentially tried to weaponize spiritual fear. American psychological warfare teams had learned that many Vietnamese cultural beliefs surrounding death and burial were taken extremely seriously, especially the idea that those who died improperly or far from home could become trapped as wandering souls. So rather than just simply trying to demoralize the enemy, Operation Wandering Soul attempted to make them feel spiritually doomed. Operation Wandering Soul was designed around specific Vietnamese spiritual and cultural beliefs surrounding death. American psych warfare teams researched local traditions involving ancestor worship, burial practice, and the belief that those who died violently or far away from home could become trapped as wandering souls, unable to find peace in the afterlife. Now, these beliefs were taken seriously throughout much of rural Vietnam, particularly among peasants and fighters who had grown up around traditional spiritual practices and funeral rituals. Utilizing this information, American Psy-Op teams began creating eerie audio recordings meant to imitate the voices of dead Viet Cong soldiers speaking from the afterlife. The tapes often included distorted voices, crying family members, funeral music, and messages begging surviving fighters to leave the jungle and return home before suffering the same fate. The recordings would then be played through hidden speakers in jungles, villages, and remote areas at night in an attempt to psychologically unsettle enemy troops. While multiple recordings and variations likely existed, very few have survived publicly, unfortunately, with Ghost Tape number 10 becoming by far the most widely known and archived example connected to this operation. One section of that recording sounded like this. Now, whether operations like Wandering Soul or the broadcast of Hanoi Hannah were truly effective is difficult to determine. Neither operation caused mass desertions or immediately changed the direction of the war, but psychological warfare is rarely measured in obvious victories or losses. Unlike a battle, there is no clear way to calculate fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, homesickness, or declining morale. And in many ways, whether these operations worked perfectly or not is not really the point. The fact is that both the Americans and the North Vietnamese were willing to study fears, emotions, spiritual beliefs, morale, and psychological exhaustion in order to manipulate enemy soldiers shows just how far the Vietnam War had escalated beyond conventional warfare. This was the ever-present reminder that in war, morale is just as important as military strength. The Americans attempted to weaponize uncertainty and cultural beliefs through propaganda campaigns and operations like Wandering Soul. And on the other side, the North Vietnamese psychological operations such as Hanoi Hannah attempted to exploit homesickness and the growing feeling of futility in the war and the growing anti-war sentiment back in America. In many ways, Vietnam was the perfect environment for this kind of warfare. Soldiers on both sides were already physically exhausted, stressed, isolated, and surrounded by an enemy that could come out of nowhere. The Americans feared the guerrilla-style warfare their enemy had perfected, while the Vietnamese fighters lived under constant bombing campaigns, artillery strikes, and the threat of overwhelming American firepower. Over time, the war itself became psychologically draining long before many soldiers were ever physically injured. Not to say that a lot of soldiers weren't physically injured. Creating the perfect conditions for both sides to test out psychological warfare. Psychological warfare was not a new concept during the Vietnam War. Governments and militaries have used propaganda, intimidation, misinformation, fear tactics, and morale attacks for centuries. But Vietnam became one of the first modern wars where psychological operations were developed and organized on such a large and experimental scale. Instead of trying to just simply kill enemy soldiers, both sides increasingly focused on manipulating emotion, fear, uncertainty, and perception itself. And while operations like Hanoi Hannah and the Ghost Tapes may sound bizarre, they helped shape the idea of psychological warfare, which, in my opinion, is the primary way wars are fought today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to check out other dark moments in history, check out my channel. Thanks for watching. Bye.